Hello again and welcome to the next session on the Guess EdTech Virtual Summit. Thank you everyone for listening. I'll pass over to the amazing Raya in a minute for a talk on education to better our world. I'm sure if you've tuned into the sessions before, you'll know that we have a live chat panel on the right, so feel free to ask your questions in there and we'll pass them along. There is a slight delay as this is moderated, but hold fire, we will get back to you. If you want to watch the session, any of our sessions again, they'll be in the Grit platform for a month after the event, so you can check them on there. We're also on social media during the event, so if you want to connect with us, go to @GuessEducation on Twitter and use the hashtag #GuessEdTech. Thank you, and now over to you, Raya.
Lovely. Just turning on my slides. Well, hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm always super excited to be speaking at the Guest Conference. I think this is my fourth one now. So today I just wanted to take some time to talk about how we can use education as a tool to better humanity and to better our world. It's something that's at the core of our philosophy at Awecademy, and we have a couple of frameworks and case studies that we often go back to that I'd love to share with you in hope of it being something that is useful to your school. Now, a little bit of background about me. I grew up here in the UAE. I went to high school here in Dubai. Shout out to the Winchester School in Jebel Ali. And I was really lucky to be a young entrepreneur. I was part of the founding team of SciFest Dubai, which was the first science festival in the region, which had up to 10,000 visitors in its first year. And the goal was to promote science through the arts and to promote a love for science. I then went on to Boston University, where I studied neuroscience, and I also worked with a couple of entrepreneurial ventures over there, such as SheWorks, and was a journalist for the Singularity Hub on topics of technology and ethics. And last year, I was honored to be listed by the BBC as one of the top 100 most influential women globally. And I'm sharing this because all throughout my life, I always loved learning by doing things. And I always loved learning by solving real global challenges. That was what was most exciting for me, and what was probably the biggest incentive for me. And I was lucky to get the opportunity to do that from a young age. And at the same time, I was also participating in lectures and the formal education system. So I was able to experience this sharp contrast between what I felt like young people needed to know to have a positive impact on humanity versus what traditional education focuses on. And of course, that sharp contrast kind of exposes a lot of problems in our education system. Now, the last few months has been incredible, and I can't move forward without commenting on the pandemic and the impact that it has had on education. As we all saw, as we all experienced, 350 million students globally moved online during the pandemic. It was probably the biggest and most unprecedented, unforeseen experiment in education, and in this case, experiment in online education. One thing that was a huge lesson learned for me during this time is my team and I are constantly advocating for global, transformative, rapid change in the education space. And I'll talk about some of those transformations that we're advocating for. And often the pushback I get is, no, real change will take time. We have to take it slowly. We have to take it incrementally. But I think what we saw over the last few months, that really quick change and really rapid transformations are possible. Now, I have been in awe of the agility that teachers have expressed and shown and proven towards this time, and even students, and how quickly everyone was able to adapt. But fundamentally, during distance learning, fundamentally nothing really changed. Simply what we did was we took the old education system and we digitized it and moved it online. And this had mixed reviews, and understandably so. So just from my experience speaking to students, different students have different preferences. Some students prefer distance learning, others prefer coming to school. Different schools did it differently. A lot of schools simply replicated the school calendar and the school timetable and digitized lectures, whereas some schools did a combination of synchronous and asynchronous. And of course, we are experiencing it in a time of crisis. So online schooling is very different when you can then go and play with your friends afterwards, or you can go out to the park in the middle of the day and come back and do some classes. Experiencing distance learning in a time of a crisis obviously tainted that experience for a lot of people. But fundamentally, the curriculum, our assessment methodologies, are in many ways the pedagogy, our teaching philosophies, none of that truly changed during the pandemic. And that is where my role and Awecademy's role comes in. What we're doing is building alternative models of education altogether. We're moving beyond simply digitizing curriculum and looking at potentially alternative models. What I'm going to do now is obviously use my organization as a case study and tell you a little bit more of the work that we're doing, but also go through a few other case studies of schools from around the world who are designing truly inspiring, innovative, alternative, radical models in education. So really excited. And meanwhile, everyone, please feel free to put in any questions in the chat. I will take them as they come and potentially at the end as well. So the first case study I want to share is our model. Now, at Awecademy, we're working on a full-time alternative high school, so alternative to traditional school system. And we're actually working with various government entities around the world and ministries of education all around the world to actually pilot this model. What we're designing is a system and a model where there are no subjects. So instead, the curriculum is based on skills and competencies and is completely interdisciplinary. We don't do traditional grades and report cards. Instead, we assess learners through their positive impact on the world and through this mastery of skills. We don't do lectures. Learners, the online learning is interactive. They participate in one-on-one mentorship, interactive workshops, and personalized learning journeys. The emphasis isn't on memorizing facts, but rather developing positive mindsets and building their skills, network, and portfolio. And finally, we're not doing school buildings. It's a fully online model initially, and then moving into blended models in partnerships with innovation hubs. Now, a core of the model is something that's called challenge-based learning. Now, challenge-based learning is a framework put forth by Apple. And in fact, if you look up challenge-based learning, the website has a lot of amazing resources and worksheets and frameworks that you can use. And fundamentally, it's simply about designing curriculum around learners solving challenges. It's very simple. And this is the 3 steps that are part of the challenge-based learning process. It involves learning going through an engagement phase, then an investigation phase, and then an act phase. And what we're advocating is not to have this just as extracurricular, but as a potential alternative to the traditional curriculum. So imagine if learners came to school every day and every term they identified a global problem or a local problem even that they wanted to solve. And then the curriculum that they went through was all about solving that problem. So the math that they learned was through the dimension of using it to solve this problem. The language skills that they're building is by writing business plans for the solutions that they're developing. So everything comes back to the challenge that they're solving. It's a way for them to not just better the world, it makes learning much more exciting when it's incentivized through that service of bettering the world. One of the other elements that we've been piloting is moving out of the school building and embedding schools into innovation hubs and into existing ecosystems. So we work, some of the sessions, for example, that we do are out of Area 2071 and Emirates Towers. So for those of you who don't know, Area 2071 is it's an initiative of the Prime Minister's office, and it's part of the UAE's 100-year Centennial Plan. They bring together corporations, startups, government entities, all with the vision of creating an exciting future for Dubai. And we embedded one of our learning hubs out of Area 2071, which made it so much more exciting for the students. We did a similar thing with the Al Futtaim Education Foundation. We're running an amazing program with them right now. And their innovation hub is becoming home to our second learning hub. And we also have a partnership with the HP Innovation Garage. And we do a lot of sessions out of HP Innovation Garage, which is based out of the Dubai Technology and Entrepreneurship Center. So moving outside of school buildings and embedding learning into existing entrepreneurial ecosystems, innovation ecosystems, we find completely changes the energy that the students have and their desire to, again, solve global challenges. It also means that students get direct access to mentors, to industry expert mentors. They're able to see the relevance of their learning because they're able to see its application in a work setting, in a professional work setting, as opposed to in the silo of just the buildings of a school. It also means you're seeing innovation in the architecture around which learning occurs. Really do believe the environment that which learning happens in has a huge impact on learning as well. Now, we've seen that in education and in ed tech, there has been a lot of investment poured into ed tech, which is great. There's lots of amazing companies out there doing incredible work using the technology, but we've not seen enough innovation with the curriculum, right? So what we teach students is just as important as how we teach those students. And so at Awecademy, we don't define ourselves as an ed tech company, but rather as an educational reform company. And here you can see a high-level summary of our core curriculum. So we have obviously the traditional numeracy and language skills, but we've moved forward to focusing on tech skills, conceptual skills like scientific thinking, logical reasoning, systems thinking, problem-solving skills, emotional intelligence, existential intelligence, blue sky thinking, obviously technology proficiencies in robotics, AI, virtual reality, and so much more. And again, the goal is to not just have this be extracurricular. This should be what students focus on in the core curriculum. And it's very much informed by what entities like the World Economic Forum have identified as the necessary skills of the future. And as you can see, a lot of our curriculum also places significant emphasis on existential awareness, on developing wisdom, mindfulness, awe, and wonder for the world. And we think that this becomes particularly important during COVID, during a time of crisis, during a pandemic, to really allow learners to be in the present moment and to focus on what really matters, to find gratitude, to find inner peace, to put it that way. And so, in fact, during the summer, during the lockdowns, we did a number of online summer camps, but we actually refocused the curriculum to what we felt like young people actually really needed to know during summer. And it wasn't necessarily doing calculus or traditional school curriculum. What we focused on is preparing them for the increasingly remote workforce, on developing their emotional and existential intelligence, on allowing them to think across systems to solve the COVID-19 challenge. I think that's an amazing way to think about how we can make curriculum more meaningful and more relevant in times of a crisis. Now, as you can see, our core curriculum is also incredibly interdisciplinary. We don't separate things by subject. This is because reality is completely interdisciplinary. Disciplines only exist in our minds. But if you look at any global challenge, and we're talking about using education to better our world, and if you look at any global challenge, whether it's climate change or the refugee crisis, no single discipline can explain and solve that challenge. Instead, a collection of disciplines can. So fundamentally, challenge-based learning at its core needs to be interdisciplinary. That's absolutely vital. So as you can see, our model is designed to be a radical alternative to traditional education. Now, we're not out to necessarily replace schools. All we're saying is that there are parents and teachers and students who the traditional system is just not suited for, and who would rather move through curriculum and their high school years in an alternative way. And so instead of content, they want to build their skills. Instead of exams, they want to develop global solutions. Instead of having subject-based learning, they want it to be interdisciplinary, completely personalized. But above all, what we're doing really is changing the incentives of learning. Right now, traditionally, what incentivizes learning is exam grades. And teachers, are unfortunately pushed into a system where they have to be incentivized to teach by those exam grades. But what we're saying is we need to reinvent the education system to focus on incentives coming from awe and wonder and curiosity and bettering the world. That should be what incentivizes learning. I'm going to go through a few other case studies because Awecademy isn't the only entity working on this. So some of you may have heard of the London Interdisciplinary School. They're actually a university. They're a completely interdisciplinary university. They don't do subjects or majors, or you don't do a bachelor's in a single discipline. Instead, you go into this university and you solve global challenges, and you gain your bachelor degrees by learning through solving global challenges. And they just became the first organization to be granted degree providing authority by the UK, not just for a model like this, but for any new alternative university in the last 100 years. So it's a huge, huge outcome. So the point I'm making is that these models are becoming accredited. At a government and ministry level, people are starting to recognize that there are different ways of doing things. And I think that is so exciting. The next example is the New View School in Boston. Again, it's a school with no grades, no classes, and no subjects. Instead, students learn in 2-week studios. And as you can see from these pictures, they build things all day. They develop a portfolio of solutions. And their alumni has been accepted into dozens of universities just by portfolio-based transcripts. And there's a similar school in Netherlands called the Agora School. Again, no grades, no classes, no subjects, and not even a fixed curriculum. And they're doing an incredible job in terms of developing these models. A final case study, and in fact, a resource that I highly recommend, is the Mastery Transcript Consortium. So the Mastery Transcript is an alternative to report cards. Instead of having the subject and the grade like A, B, C, or F, or GPA, what the Mastery Transcript shows is a list of transferable skills and the level of mastery across each skill. And then that is linked to a portfolio and evidence for mastering that skill. Last year, 350 universities received at least one mastery transcript in the US alone, and not a single admission officer mentioned that they cannot use the mastery transcript. So the consortium is a collection of schools that have decided to adopt the mastery transcript instead of a traditional transcript. And I strongly urge all of you to join the consortium. We just joined the consortium. I think it's an amazing movement in terms of alternative models of education that come back to bettering the world. I'm going to skip over a few things here. But yeah, so as you can see, I'm a huge fan of Moonshot Thinking. I don't believe that incremental changes in education are enough. We're living through a world of unprecedented change, accelerating change due to exponential technologies, but also due to other forces such as COVID-19. And so I really urge educators, school leaders, innovation leaders, instead of thinking about 10% improvements, to think about solutions and models and curriculum changes that represent 10x improvements over the status quo. And above all, I don't believe that Moonshot Thinking needs to just apply to technology. We also need to 10x our policies, our pedagogy, our curriculum, and even our mindsets as educators. Of course, there are many barriers. So the case studies that I shared today, the London Interdisciplinary School, Nubu School, Mastery Transcripts, Awecademy's model. One thing that we've learned that I advocate for as well is you have to take a systems thinking approach when you're approaching education. You can't develop something like this without educating parents, without having partnerships with universities, without having partnerships with regulators and governments to get these models accredited. And above all, without upskilling teachers so that they start to transition out of the traditional system into these alternative models of education. But ultimately, what is really exciting, and I think COVID really gave us this opportunity, is the rise of a new paradigm, a reset in education. We were recently at a webinar where some of our students were speaking. Their amazing projects were being highlighted, some of the solutions they developed to global challenges. And one of the students, Hadi, said something that really stuck with me that I want to share with all of you. He said that I hope that schools don't, everyone's talking about going back to normal, but let's not go back to normal. Let's create something new out of this. Let's create a new education system out of this. And really, that's what I believe we should be doing, is exploring the adjacent possible of the alternative models that is possible in education. But ultimately, I think we need to remind ourselves what the purpose of education is. It's not just to prepare students for exams. It's not just to prepare them for universities or just to prepare them for getting jobs. Yes, those things are important. But beyond that, it's to inspire a generation of critical thinkers, of compassionate citizens, of cosmic citizens, and creative innovators. When we talk about using education to better our world, that's what we need to do. And we need to remember, when we talk about bettering our world, it's not just about giving students tech skills. Human progress is also about technological progress, intellectual, social, moral, spiritual, and economic progress. And so our curriculum needs to be revamped to focus on these elements of progress that actually push humanity forward. And ultimately, what I hope that we can all do together is to not just innovate the existing system. And I think a lot of schools are doing an amazing job of innovating the existing system, and I've heard of amazing case studies there. But in parallel, we need to start building a new model of education, an alternative model of education, not just to give parents and educators and learners more variety of different ways of doing things, but to actually start to create a model that is designed for today's world and not the industrial era. So ultimately, we want to use education as a tool for positive civilization level change. Now that brings me to the end of my presentation. We have some time for questions, and I can see there's already 2 questions in the Q&A. So I'm just gonna take these. One of the questions here is, how do you deal with safeguarding child protection concerns within an alternative education model? That's a great question. So one thing to absolutely highlight, that alternative education does not mean bad education, and it doesn't mean it's unregulated education. So an example I can give, in the Netherlands, they have private schools, public schools, and then they have special schools. Special schools are schools like alternative models, like Montessori schools, schools like the Agora school that don't have a traditional curriculum. These schools are still heavily quality assured. There are still inspection frameworks in place to make sure that there are learning outcomes, the learning outcomes are being met, that enough learning is being done, and of course, safety, privacy, all of those things are addressed as well. So in any, just as you have like the KC inspection framework, there are alternative forms of inspection frameworks and accreditation that allow for alternative models, but at the same time, quality assure and ensure safety. So alternative model of education doesn't have to be completely unregulated and completely unsafe. On the contrary, we're advocating that we have new forms of accreditation frameworks that allow for radical innovation, but also have the students' safety in mind. And of course, their well-being and their progress. So that's that question there. There is another question about mastery skills. I'm just gonna take a moment to read it first. It says, can you explain more about how you measure these skills? Is it based on an assessment or just attendance, interaction with the content? That's a great question. So this is one of the biggest areas of our innovation as well. So currently with our extracurricular programs, we've actually started to pilot some assessment tools. So if I go back to the core curriculum for a second. So one of the things we've done is we've moved away from one summative exam at the end of a 2-year period, or even at the end of a term, towards smaller formative assessments throughout the school year. Now, how you measure each of these things on the core curriculum varies. So how you measure emotional intelligence versus how you measure tech skills versus how you measure mathematical thinking versus how you measure systems thinking is different. So for this is a very high level summary. Under each of these areas, we've developed learning outcomes and ways of measuring those learning outcomes. For some of these, they might be interview-based assessments. For others, it might be written-based assessments or presentation-based assessments or project-based assessments or problem-based assessments. So it really varies. We have a rich, diverse form of assessments. Another movement that we have really adopted is this idea of meaningful assessments, of giving the student autonomy to express, to show you that they've met the learning outcomes in the way that suits them the best, right? So if they're an artistic student, they exhibit the fact that they take a cosmic perspective through the work, to the arts. If they are, let's say, a particularly excellent speaker, maybe they do a presentation on a problem that they solved using systems thinking. So basically opening up these restrictions and allowing students to have personalized assessments. So those are some of the ways that we've tackled this issue. And so it's really rich. It really moves away from traditional. And we've actually had to develop all of these assessments ourselves right now, but also some of them in partnership with other companies and other educational organizations. The last thing I'll say about assessment, and it's a challenge that I think we all have to deal with, when it comes to things like mathematical skills or technological skills, there's often a right or wrong answer. So it's very easy to assess. things like emotional intelligence, mindfulness, enlightenment values. We really have to rethink this notion of assessment and how we validate progress, because often these are much more open and don't necessarily have one right or wrong answer. There, we're mostly assessing divergent thinking rather than convergent thinking. So there's another question here. Says, is the mastery transcript accepted in UAE universities? That's an excellent question. I have good news and bad news. The bad news is no, it's not accepted. Not because universities don't want to accept it, but because the Ministry of Education doesn't attest those transcripts. So universities have to follow the Ministry of Education law, and unless the Ministry of Education attests those diplomas, they cannot accept it. And that's what we're working on. So we're currently working with the Regulations Lab and multiple entities to actually change that and to start pilot projects where those transcripts are attested. And in fact, we're working with a lot of schools who want to express their interest, who would like to see this tested, because our work isn't just about us. It's about opening up innovation so that other schools can do so as well. So I'm actually gonna, I don't know if there's a way to publish my email, but I'm gonna leave my email in the chat. If you as a school would like to join in on that conversation, and we're doing a survey to express to the ministry and other regulators the interest around these alternative models. So if you would like to participate in that, please email me. But elsewhere in the world, there has been acceptance of mastery transcripts in the US, in the UK, in Europe. That movement has been picking up. I think we have time for one more question before we run out of time. There's a question about, let's see. So it says alternatives you've spoken about. Does this mean that you would have different facilities for these projects, timings of schools, class sizes? Yes, the short answer is a lot of these things need to be rethought. Timings of schools, one of the things we constantly do is question our assumptions about the existing education system. We assume that students have to be in school from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. We assume that we have to have schools at 5 days a week, that we have to have class sizes be at a certain amount. These are all assumptions that we carry with us. And what we're saying is, can we challenge those assumptions? Are they still valid in this 21st century era? So even for our blended model, we're looking at giving students flexibility. Maybe some parents and students want to come in 3 days a week. Maybe some students want to come in at 10 a.m. There's a lot of research that shows that for teenagers, they really struggle to wake up really early in the morning, and that there's biological reasons for that. So often it does mean rethinking all of those things. But that being said, you're able to adopt alternative models with keeping some of those things the same way as well. I see we still have 3 more minutes, so we'll do one more question. There's a follow-up question here about how we record, report, and manage concerns. Do we use an electronic platform or something that you've thought yourself? I'm not sure if the question is referring to recording these skills that we're seeing right now, in which case, yes, absolutely. We're using a lot of amazing tech and adaptive learning platforms to track all of these learning outcomes and to be able to get a deeper insight into students. And of course, like any educational institute, there has to be processes in place for any concerns that are raised. So I think that answers all the questions that we got in, and that brings me to the end of the presentation. Once again, please reach out if you would like to collaborate or if you would like to learn more about any of these things. Great, thank you so much. That's amazing. I shared the email address in the chat, so you should be able to see that. If not, you can connect to Raya through the platform, and I'm sure she'll answer any questions and would love to hear from you. Once this finishes, you'll be redirected to a short survey, so do tell us what you thought and any topics you'd like to hear in the future. A massive thank you to everyone, and don't forget our next session is coming up in about 15 minutes. So we hope you enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.